All right, settle in, because today we're venturing into those shadowy corners where the unbelievable seems to brush up against reality. You know the kind of stories I'm talking about. The ones that make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The ones that linger in your thoughts long after you've heard them. These are tales whispered in hushed tones, accounts of encounters that defy easy explanation, leaving those who experience them forever changed. We're not just talking about bumps in the night, we're talking about events that shake the very foundation of what you think is possible in this world. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, because things are about to get unsettling. Welcome back to the channel, and I appreciate you joining me for another dive into the strange, dark and mysterious. Today we have a collection of 5 stories, each one more chilling than the last, and they all come with that unsettling claim. They're said to be based on real events. Now, whether you believe them or not is entirely up to you. But the people who lived through these experiences, well, for them, the horror was all too real. These aren't just campfire tales. These are narratives that allegedly unfolded in ordinary places to ordinary people until something extraordinary and terrifying intruded. Prepare yourselves. We're about to explore accounts that will crawl under your skin and stay there. The kind that might just have you double-checking your locks tonight, maybe even triple-checking. These are the stories that fuel nightmares, the ones that make you question that fleeting shadow you saw out of the corner of your eye, or that unexplained noise from the other room. Each narrative is a journey into fear, a testament to the unknown and often malevolent forces that some believe lurk just beyond our understanding. So if you're easily spooked, consider this your final warning, because tonight we're not holding back. We're going deep into the heart of these unsettling experiences. The goal here isn't just to tell you a scary story. It's to transport you, to make you feel that cold dread, that prickling sense of unease that the original storytellers must have felt. Are you ready? Because the first story is waiting, and it's a particularly disturbing one. It might just make you sleep with the lights on tonight, assuming you can sleep at all. Let's begin, and may your courage see you through to the end of these tales. Our first story transports us to a seemingly idyllic suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids ride their bikes down tree-lined streets and neighbors wave to each other over neatly trimmed hedges. Picture white picket fences, freshly mowed lawns, and the general hum of peaceful, everyday life. This particular family, let's call them the Hendersons, had recently moved into a charming 2-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac, looking forward to a tranquil existence. They had no idea that their new home sat precariously close to a place where tranquility had long since departed, a place that held a silent, waiting darkness. Right next door to the Hendersons' new, hopeful abode stood a stark contrast, an abandoned house. This wasn't just a house that was a bit run down. This was a structure that radiated neglect and a palpable sense of desolation. Windows were boarded up, paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the overgrown yard seemed to actively repel sunlight. Local whispers and hushed rumors clung to it like cobwebs. Tales of strange occurrences, of previous owners who left in a hurry, of an unsettling atmosphere that kept even the bravest neighborhood kids at bay. It was the kind of house that you hurried past, the kind that made you feel watched. The Hendersons, however, tried to ignore the ominous presence of their decaying neighbor. Their own backyard was a source of joy, particularly their picturesque pond, which was home to a lively flock of ducks. These weren't just any ducks. They were a part of the family's daily life, their quacking a familiar soundtrack to mornings and evenings. The children loved feeding them, watching them glide across the water, their vibrant feathers a splash of life against the green. The ducks were a symbol of the peace and normalcy they sought in their new home, a comforting presence in their little slice of suburban paradise. Then one morning the Hendersons woke up to an unnerving silence. The usual cheerful quacking that greeted the dawn was completely absent. When they went to the backyard, their hearts sank. The pond was still empty. Every single one of their beloved ducks had vanished without a trace. There were no feathers scattered around, no signs of a struggle, no indication of what could have happened. It was as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. The family was baffled, a knot of unease tightening in their stomachs. They tried to rationalize it. A fox, perhaps, or a brazen raccoon, but the sheer number of missing ducks and the complete lack of evidence made any logical explanation feel hollow and insufficient. A few days crawled by after the inexplicable disappearance of the ducks. An unsettling quiet had descended upon the Henderson household, the absence of their feathered friends leaving a noticeable void. The children were particularly affected, their usual playful energy dampened by the mystery. The parents tried to maintain a brave face, but even they couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The initial theories about predators had faded, replaced by a creeping sense of the unknown. That abandoned house next door seemed to loom larger now, its silent facade more menacing than ever before. The grandmother of the family, a woman named Elsie, was visiting at the time. Elsie was a practical woman, not usually given to flights of fancy, but she possessed a certain old-world perceptiveness, an intuition that sometimes picked up on things others missed. She had her routines, and one of them, unfortunately, was a tendency towards light sleeping, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. She often found herself awake in the dead of night, the house around her still and silent, her mind replaying the day's events or simply wandering through old memories. It was during one of these nocturnal awakenings that she would witness something truly unforgettable. The clock on the bedside table glowed a malevolent 3 a.m. that infamous hour, when the veil between worlds is said to be at its thinnest. Elsie had woken up feeling thirsty and had quietly made her way downstairs for a glass of water. As she stood in the kitchen, a strange compulsion made her glance out the window that overlooked the backyard, and beyond it, the brooding silhouette of the abandoned house. The moon was a slender crescent, casting long, eerie shadows across the neglected property. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dim light, scanned the familiar yet unsettling landscape. And then she saw it. Perched impossibly on the steeply pitched rooftop of the derelict house next door was a figure. It was small, like a child, and it was wearing a dress that even in the faint moonlight seemed to be a vivid, startling red. The figure was just standing there, unnervingly still, looking out over the darkened neighborhood. Elsie blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the image remained. A girl, in a red dress, on the roof of an abandoned house at 3 a.m. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through Elsie's heart, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was no ordinary child. The next morning, Elsie, visibly shaken, recounted her pre-dawn vision to the rest of the family. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the girl in the red dress, the impossible sight on the rooftop of the abandoned house. The initial reactions were a mixture of concern for Elsie's well-being and polite skepticism. Her son and daughter-in-law exchanged worried glances, gently suggesting it might have been a vivid dream, a trick of the moonlight, or perhaps the stress of the new environment and the missing ducks playing on her mind. The children, however, listened with wide, fearful eyes, the story adding a new layer of terror to the already unsettling atmosphere of their home. Despite the adults' attempts to rationalize Elsie's experience, a heavier sense of unease began to permeate the Henderson household. It wasn't long before other strange occurrences started to plague them, subtle at first, then gradually more pronounced. They would hear faint, inexplicable noises at night, soft scuttling sounds from the attic, whispers that seemed to drift from empty rooms, the distinct creak of floorboards when everyone was supposedly asleep. Objects would sometimes be found in different places from where they were left, not dramatically moved, but just enough to make them question their own memories. A persistent, unnerving feeling of being watched settled over them, especially when they were near the side of the house that faced the abandoned property. The narrator of this story, Elsie's grandson, let's call him Tom, was a teenager at the time, old enough to feel the growing dread, but also driven by a youthful curiosity and a desire to find answers. The mystery of the missing duck still bothered him immensely, and his grandmother's terrifying story about the girl in the red dress had only deepened his unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that all these strange events were connected, somehow tied to the decaying house next door and the empty pond in their backyard. He decided, against his parents' subtle warnings, to do a little investigating of his own around the pond area. Armed with a flashlight and a nervous resolve, Tom began to meticulously search the perimeter of the pond and the overgrown bushes that lined the edge of their property, close to the fence separating them from the abandoned house. He was looking for any clue, any feather, any sign that might explain what had happened to their beloved ducks. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, his foot kicked something soft and yielding hidden beneath a dense thicket of weeds. He knelt down, pushing aside the leaves, and his blood ran cold. There, partially concealed, was a small, gruesome pile of animal bones picked clean. And nestled amongst them, unmistakable and horrifying, was a small, blooded skull. It was undeniably animal, but the implications were sickening, painting a grim picture of the duck's fate. Tom recoiled from the grisly discovery, his stomach churning with a mixture of horror and dawning, terrible understanding. The image of those small, clean-picked bones and the blood-smeared skull seared itself into his mind. This wasn't the work of a fox or a raccoon. This felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The missing ducks, his grandmother's chilling sighting of the girl in the red dress, the constant unsettling feeling of being watched. It all started to coalesce into a terrifying narrative. The abandoned house next door, which had always been a source of unease, now felt like a gaping maw of absolute malevolence, its dark windows like empty eyes staring directly into their lives. That night, sleep was an impossibility for Tom. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside his window sent jolts of adrenaline through him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the gruesome image of the bones replaying in his thoughts. He tried to tell himself there was a logical explanation, but his grandmother's description of the girl in the red dress kept intruding, her spectral form now inextricably linked to the violence he had uncovered. A morbid, irresistible compulsion grew within him, a need to look out his window towards the source of his growing terror, the abandoned house. With a trembling hand, he pulled back the curtain just a fraction, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, plunging the neighbouring property into an even deeper darkness than usual. At first he saw nothing but the familiar, menacing silhouette of the derelict structure. He was about to let the curtain fall, a small wave of relief washing over him, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Not on the rooftop this time, but lower, closer, perhaps near the shadowy porch or what was once a garden. And then he saw her, the girl in the red dress. She was standing there, partially obscured by the overgrown foliage, but the vibrant red of her dress was unmistakable, a splash of nightmare colour in the monochrome gloom. And this time she wasn't looking away. She was staring directly at his window, directly at him. Her face, pale and indistinct in the darkness, seemed to float above the crimson fabric. But it was her eyes that seized him with an icy grip of terror. They were like dark, empty sockets, devoid of any light, any life, any humanity, and her mouth, he could just make it out, was twitching, a series of small, unnatural spasms that suggested a silent, horrifying mimicry of speech or a prelude to some unspeakable act. Tom froze, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated horror of that direct, malevolent gaze. Our next story takes us to the edge of a vast, notoriously deep lake, a body of water known more for its chilling legends and treacherous currents than for its scenic beauty. Locals whispered tales about it, stories of unexplained disappearances that dated back generations of strange things sighted in its inky depths, and of an unnerving coldness that seemed to emanate from its very core, even on the hottest summer days. The water itself was a murky, opaque green-brown, swallowing light within a few feet of the surface, promising a world of unseen hazards and perpetual twilight for anyone brave or foolish enough to venture too far down. The catalyst for our story is a tragedy that had recently befallen a local family. Their young son, a bright and energetic boy of about 10, had vanished while playing near the lake's edge. One moment he was there, skipping stones and laughing. The next, he was gone. A frantic search had immediately ensued, involving local police, volunteer fire departments, and scores of concerned community members. They scoured the shoreline, dragged the shallower sections, and sent boats crisscrossing the surface for days. But the lake clutched its secrets tightly. Hope dwindled with each passing hour, replaced by a grim, heartbreaking certainty. After several days of fruitless searching by local teams, the authorities, under pressure from the grieving and desperate family, made the difficult decision to call in a specialist. This wasn't just any weekend scuba enthusiast. This was a professional recovery diver, a man named Marcus, who had built a somber reputation for his skill in locating and retrieving victims from the most challenging underwater environments. He was often the last resort, the one called when all other efforts had failed, bringing a grim kind of closure to families consumed by the agony of uncertainty. His arrival was met with a mixture of renewed, albeit faint, hope and a heavy sense of impending sorrow. Marcus arrived at the lake, his demeanour calm and professional, though his eyes took in the vast, unwelcoming expanse of water with a practiced assessment of the dangers it held. He listened intently as the local sheriff briefed him on the situation, detailing the search efforts so far, the last known whereabouts of the boy, and the known hazards of this particular lake, the extreme depth in certain areas, the poor visibility, and the unpredictable underwater currents. The boy's parents were there, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion, and Marcus felt the immense weight of their silent plea. His task was clear: to descend into that cold, dark water and bring their son home, no matter what he might find. Marcus began his meticulous preparations for the dive. This was no recreational plunge into clear, sunlit waters. This was a serious undertaking into an environment that was inherently hostile to human life. He checked and double-checked every piece of his specialized gear: the heavy-duty dry suit to protect against the biting cold of the deep, the powerful underwater lights designed to pierce the oppressive murk, the redundant air supplies, and the communication system connecting him to the surface team. Each buckle, each valve, each connection was examined with a practiced eye. There was no room for error when venturing into such unforgiving depths, where the line between life and death could be razor-thin. With a final nod to his surface support crew, Marcus slipped over the side of the boat and into the cold embrace of the lake. The initial shock of the temperature was quickly mitigated by his dry suit, but the sudden transition from the world of air and light to the silent alien realm below was always a little disorienting. As he began his controlled descent, the familiar sounds of the surface world faded away, replaced by the rhythmic hiss of his regulator and the thumping of his own heart. The murky water immediately began to close in around him, the sunlight struggling to penetrate more than a few feet. The deeper he went, the darker and more oppressive the environment became. His powerful dive lights cut cones through the particulate-laden water, illuminating a swirling dance of silt and unseen organisms, but beyond their limited reach was an impenetrable blackness. It felt like descending into a liquid night, a void where the usual rules of perception no longer applied. He kept a close eye on his depth gauge and compass, maintaining a slow, methodical descent towards the coordinates where the boy was last thought to be. The pressure mounted with each passing foot, a tangible reminder of the immense weight of the water above him. Reaching the target depth zone, Marcus began his search pattern across the lakebed. The bottom was a desolate landscape of mud, silt and decaying vegetation, punctuated by occasional rocks and fallen logs that loomed out of the darkness like grotesque sculptures. Visibility was severely limited, often just a few feet, forcing him to move slowly and scan his surroundings with intense focus. The silence was profound, broken only by his own breathing, creating a sense of profound isolation. He was a solitary explorer in a cold, indifferent abyss, searching for a tragic secret hidden within its murky embrace. The task was mentally and physically demanding, requiring unwavering concentration in an environment designed to disorient and intimidate. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the cold, silent depths. Marcus continued his systematic sweep of the lakebed, his light beam methodically cutting through the gloom, back and forth, back and forth. He had been down for what felt like an eternity, the oppressive weight of the water and the grim nature of his task pressing in on him. He fought off the insidious chill that tried to seep into his bones and the mental fatigue that came with such intense, prolonged concentration in near-zero visibility. He knew he couldn't stay down indefinitely. His air supply, though ample, was finite. Just as a sliver of doubt began to creep into his mind, his light beam snagged on something out of place. He moved closer, his heart rate quickening slightly despite his practiced composure. As the indistinct shape resolved itself in the beam of his light, a chill, far colder than the lake water, traced its way down his spine. It was the missing boy. But there was something profoundly, disturbingly wrong. The boy was lying on the silty bottom, not tangled in debris or wedged between rocks as one might expect. He was perfectly, eerily intact. His clothes were undisturbed, his features peaceful, almost as if he were merely asleep. There were no signs of the usual trauma or the bloating and decomposition that would be expected after days in the water. It was as if time itself had frozen around him, preserving him in an unnatural, pristine state. Marcus, though a seasoned professional accustomed to tragic sights, felt a deep sense of unease at this unnatural preservation. It defied logic, defied the natural processes he knew so well. Shaking off the disturbing thoughts, he focused on the task at hand, recovery. He signaled to the surface crew via his comm line that he had located the target and was preparing for retrieval. He carefully maneuvered himself closer to the boy, his movements slow and deliberate, trying not to disturb the scene more than necessary. He reached out, his gloved hand moving to gently secure the boy for the ascent, a wave of sadness washing over him for the young life lost. But just as his fingers were about to make contact, just as he was bracing himself for the delicate process of lifting the small form, something seized him with incredible, violent force. It wasn't a snag on a hidden branch or a sudden current. This was a distinct, powerful pull from below, as if an unseen hand had grabbed his leg or his equipment, yanking him downwards with terrifying strength. Panic, cold and sharp, instantly flooded his system. He was being dragged deeper into the abyss, away from the boy, away from the faint hope of the surface, by something he couldn't see, something that felt immensely strong and decidedly malevolent. Instinct and training kicked in amidst the terror. Marcus thrashed wildly, desperately trying to break free from whatever had hold of him. He twisted and turned, kicking out with his fins, his mind racing to comprehend the source of the attack. Was it a massive, unseen creature? Some bizarre entanglement he hadn't noticed? Or something far stranger? Something the local legends hinted at? The force was relentless, pulling him further down into the crushing pressure and absolute darkness. He knew his air supply was limited, and every second spent struggling was a second closer to a fatal outcome. His survival instincts screamed at him to escape now. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he managed to wrench himself free from the unseen grip. He didn't pause to look back, didn't try to understand what had just happened. His only thought was to get to the surface, to escape the terrifying, unseen entity that lurked in the Stygian depths of that cursed lake. He abandoned the recovery of the boy, a decision that would haunt him, but his own life was paramount. He initiated a rapid, though controlled, ascent, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs, every fibre of his being straining towards the distant, life-giving light. He broke the surface with a gasp, ripping off his mask and gulping in air, his body trembling uncontrollably. The surface crew, alarmed by his garbled communications during the struggle and his rapid ascent, quickly pulled him back into the boat. He was disoriented, shaken to his core, babbling about being pulled, attacked by something unseen. It took some time for him to calm down, to piece together the terrifying sequence of events that had unfolded in the abyss. Later, as he was being checked over and the adrenaline began to subside, he noticed angry red welts on his arm and his leg, where he had felt the grip. When his dry suit was removed, the marks were even clearer, deep parallel abrasions, almost like claw marks. When Marcus recounted his harrowing experience to the authorities, his story was met with polite skepticism. They attributed his account to nitrogen narcosis, the disorienting effects of pressure at depth, or perhaps oxygen deprivation leading to a vivid hallucination. The claw marks, they suggested, were probably from snagging on a sharp rock or a piece of submerged debris during his panicked ascent. But Marcus knew what he had felt. He knew the distinct sensation of being grabbed and pulled by something powerful and alive, and the perfectly patterned scratches on his skin, which healed into faint silvery scars, were a constant physical reminder that what he had encountered in the dark, silent depths of that lake was no hallucination. The boy tragically remained in the lake's cold embrace, guarded by whatever malevolent force had claimed him, and Marcus never dived in that cursed water again. All right, so for our third story, we head into the heart of a bustling city, a place where the night comes alive with lights and music and the promise of adventure. Our main character, let's call him Ben, was just like any other guy looking to unwind after a particularly grueling week at work. He wasn't looking for trouble, wasn't looking for anything specific really, just a chance to let off some steam, maybe have a few drinks, and forget about spreadsheets and deadlines for a little while. He decided to hit up a popular nightclub, one of those spots that's always thumping with a bass line you can feel in your chest, a place where shadows dance just as much as the people on the floor. He found himself a spot near the bar, soaking in the electric atmosphere. The music was loud, the lights were a hypnotic swirl of colour, and the air was thick with the scent of perfume and spilled drinks. You know the kind of place. Ben was nursing his drink, just people watching, when he saw her. Across the crowded room, through the haze of the smoke machine and the flashing strobes, she stood out like a beacon. He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but there was an aura about her, something magnetic that drew his gaze and held it. She was, by all accounts, stunningly beautiful, but it was more than that. There was an intriguing mystery in her eyes. So, Ben and Lily left the vibrant chaos of the nightclub behind, stepping out into the comparatively quiet cool of the late-night city air. The transition was almost jarring, from the sensory overload of the club to the relative stillness of the streets. They hailed a cab, and during the short ride the conversation continued, still laced with that easy chemistry they'd found earlier. Ben found himself looking forward to seeing her place, imagining it might reflect the same kind of intriguing personality she projected. He was feeling good, optimistic even, about how the night was unfolding. He wasn't expecting anything more than good company and maybe a nightcap before heading home. The cab pulled up to an older apartment building, one that had clearly seen better days. It wasn't run down exactly, but it lacked the polished gleam of some of the newer complexes in the city. Ben didn't think much of it. After all, it's what's on the inside that counts, right? They made their way up a narrow staircase to her apartment. When Lily opened the door, Ben was met with an interior that was tidy, almost clinically so. It was sparsely furnished, with a minimalist aesthetic that felt a little cold, a little impersonal. It wasn't what he'd expected, but again he brushed off the faint, almost imperceptible feeling of unease. She offered him a drink, and he accepted, settling onto a stiff, uncomfortable couch.
I really wasn't sure.
Ben, trying to navigate this unexpected turn, did his best to answer her increasingly pointed questions. He offered more compliments, attempting to be specific, to elaborate on what he found attractive about her, hoping to satisfy whatever it was she was seeking. But with each answer he gave, her expression seemed to harden, her eyes scrutinizing him with an unnerving intensity. It felt like he was walking a tightrope, and the wrong word, the wrong inflection, might send him tumbling. The air grew heavier, the silence between her demands stretching out, filled with a tension that was becoming almost unbearable. He was definitely starting to regret coming back here. The shift in Lily became undeniable and frankly alarming. The charming, vivacious woman he'd met at the club seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by someone who was cold, calculating, and deeply unsettling. "Is that all?" she'd counter after one of his compliments, her voice flat, devoid of the musical quality it had possessed earlier. "You're not being very convincing, Ben. I need to know you mean it." His initial unease was now rapidly morphing into genuine fear. This wasn't just an awkward situation anymore. Something was very, very wrong, and he was in the middle of it, in her apartment with the door closed. Mark, or rather Ben, as we've been calling him, felt a primal surge of adrenaline, a fight-or-flight response kicking in with full force. His mind was racing, desperately trying to process the sudden, terrifying reality of his situation. He knew with absolute certainty that he had to escape. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he also knew that any sudden aggressive move could provoke her, could escalate the situation with potentially fatal consequences, especially with that knife so close. He had to be smart, he had to be calm, or at least appear calm, while his insides were churning with pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to placate her, forcing himself to speak, to offer more compliments, anything to buy himself a few precious seconds, a momentary distraction. He told her she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever met, that her eyes were captivating, that her intelligence was dazzling. He was spewing whatever came to mind, his voice probably shaking despite his best efforts. All the while his eyes were frantically scanning the room, looking for any possible advantage, any chance, however slim, to get away from her and that gleaming blade. He noted the distance to the door, the type of lock, anything that could aid his escape. Then, for a fraction of a second, an opportunity presented itself. Perhaps she shifted her weight, or her gaze flickered away from him for just a moment as she considered his latest forced praise. Whatever it was, Ben didn't hesitate. He lunged, not towards her, but towards the door, a desperate, explosive movement fueled by sheer panic. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, expecting at any second to feel the cold steel of the knife in his back or her hands grabbing at him. The sound of his own ragged breathing and thumping heart filled his ears as he finally wrenched the door open. He burst out of the apartment and into the dimly lit hallway, not daring to look back. He scrambled down the narrow staircase, his feet pounding on the steps, taking them 2 or 3 at a time. He didn't stop running until he was out of the building and onto the relative safety of the street, gasping for breath, his body trembling. The cool night air, which had felt inviting just hours before, now felt like the first clean breath he'd taken since stepping into her apartment. Only when he'd put several blocks between himself and that building did he finally stop, leaning against a wall, and pull out his phone to dial 911, his voice still shaking as he relayed the terrifying encounter. The police arrived, and the story took an even more disturbing turn when they informed him that he wasn't her first victim. Lily had a documented history of luring men back to her apartment and subjecting them to similar terrifying ordeals. The story I'm about to share with you is a chilling reminder that sometimes the people we think we know best can harbour the deepest, most unsettling secrets. This particular account comes from a woman we'll call Sarah, and it revolves around her ex-boyfriend, a man we'll name Mark. When Sarah and Mark first got together, things were, for the most part, pretty normal. He was charming, attentive, and they shared a lot of laughs. There was a connection there, one that made Sarah feel like perhaps, Just perhaps, this could be something serious, something lasting. But as the months ticked by, subtle cracks began to appear in the facade of their idyllic relationship. Tiny fissures that would eventually widen into a terrifying chasm. The first truly jarring incident, the one that planted a seed of unease so deep it would never fully be uprooted, happened on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening. Sarah was at Mark's apartment making dinner while he was supposedly tidying up his living room. She called out to him, asking where he kept the good olive oil, and when he didn't answer, she poked her head around the corner. What she saw made the spatula clatter from her hand. Mark was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, holding his large hunting knife, a blade he usually kept locked away. He wasn't cleaning it. He was talking to it, whispering to the polished steel as if it were a confidant, a sentient being. His voice was low, intense, and the words she couldn't quite make out seemed to carry a strange, almost reverent tone. Sarah stood there, frozen, a cold dread creeping up her spine. What in the world was he doing? Was this some kind of bizarre joke she wasn't in on? She quietly backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs, and pretended she hadn't seen anything. Later that evening, she tried to bring it up casually, asking about the knife, but Mark just laughed it off, saying he was just admiring the craftsmanship, maybe muttering to himself like he sometimes did when he was concentrating. He made it sound so trivial, so unimportant, that Sarah almost convinced herself she'd overreacted. Maybe he was just a bit eccentric, a little odd. Everyone has their quirks, right? But that image of him whispering secrets to a cold, sharp blade, it lingered in the back of her mind, a tiny, persistent alarm bell. Unfortunately, that strange devotion to his knife wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't long after the knife incidents that Sarah started to feel like she was being watched. At first, it was just a fleeting sensation. The kind of thing you dismiss as your imagination playing tricks on you. She'd be walking down the street and get that prickling feeling on the back of her neck, or she'd see a car that looked suspiciously like Mark's parked a little too far down the road from her workplace. She'd tell herself it was a coincidence, that she was just on edge because of his increasingly weird behavior. But the coincidences started piling up, becoming harder and harder to ignore. It was like a shadow had detached itself from Mark and was now following her, a constant, unseen presence making her skin crawl. Then the subtlety vanished. It was no longer a fleeting glimpse or a half-seen car. Mark was there. She'd leave her apartment in the morning and he'd be across the street, just standing there, staring, not waving, not calling out, just watching. She'd go to the grocery store and he'd be in the next aisle, pretending to look at cereal boxes, but his eyes would flick towards her, cold and calculating. One evening she went to a movie with a friend, and as they were leaving the theatre she saw him sitting in his car in the parking lot, the interior light illuminating his face, his gaze fixed directly on her. The message was clear. He knew where she was, and he wanted her to know that he knew. That cold dread she'd felt before, it was now a permanent resident in her stomach. Enough was enough. Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had to end things with Mark, definitively and for good. The man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by this obsessive, frightening stranger. Gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, she arranged to meet him in a public place. A busy coffee shop, a small island of perceived safety in the storm of her fear. She laid it all out. His disturbing behavior, the stalking, the messages, the constant fear he was instilling in her. She told him it was over, that she couldn't do this anymore, her voice trembling but firm. She half expected an outburst, a denial, perhaps even a threat. Instead, Mark's reaction was unnervingly calm, almost detached. He just listened, his eyes never leaving hers, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. When she finished, he didn't argue. He didn't plead, he simply nodded slowly and said, "I understand." But there was something in his eyes, a glint of something cold and possessive, that told Sarah this was far from over. His quiet acceptance was somehow more terrifying than any angry tirade would have been. It felt like the calm before a storm he was meticulously planning. And as she walked away from that coffee shop, she didn't feel relief. She felt a deeper, more profound sense of dread. The nights were the worst. Sarah started sleeping with every light in her small apartment blazing, a desperate attempt to ward off the encroaching darkness and the horrors it seemed to hold. But even the artificial glare couldn't penetrate the deep-seated terror that had taken root in her soul. Every creak of the old building's floorboards, every rustle of leaves skittering across her window pane, every distant siren sent her heart leaping into her throat. The silence between those sounds was even more terrifying, pregnant with unspoken threats, with the possibility of him being near, of him being closer than she could bear to imagine. Darkness was no longer a comfort, but a canvas upon which her deepest fears painted vivid, horrifying scenarios. The most persistent, most gnawing fear was that he was already inside. It was an insidious thought that burrowed its way into her mind and refused to leave. She'd check the locks on her doors and windows obsessively 3, 4, 5 times before daring to even try to rest. She'd wedge a chair under her bedroom doorknob, a flimsy barricade against an unseen, unknown threat. But still, the thought would whisper, was that faint sound from the kitchen just the refrigerator humming? Or was it a footstep, soft and deliberate, on her linoleum floor? Her own home had become a house of horrors. We all have that one friend, don't we? The one who knows you better than anyone else, the one you've shared your deepest secrets with, your triumphs, your heartbreaks. For the narrator of this next story, that person was Alex. Their friendship wasn't just casual. It was a bond, forged over years of shared experiences, unwavering support, and a level of understanding that felt almost telepathic. They were, in every sense of the word, best friends, closer than siblings. 2 peas in a pod. They navigated the treacherous waters of life together, always having each other's back. This deep ingrained trust made what happened next all the more horrifying, all the more unbelievable. The first hint that something was amiss with Alex was so subtle, so fleeting, that the narrator almost didn't register it consciously. It was like a tiny discordant note in a familiar, beloved melody. Maybe it was a new coldness that crept into Alex's eyes during a casual conversation, or a joke that landed with a thud, its humour tinged with an uncharacteristic cruelty. Or perhaps it was the beginning of those stares, moments when Alex would just look at them unblinking for a beat too long, an unnerving stillness settling over their features. The narrator, wanting to believe the best of their friend, initially brushed these moments aside, attributing them to stress or a bad day or just Alex being Alex. Around the same time I began noticing these unsettling changes in Alex, strange things started happening in our quiet town. It all began small, almost unnoticeable if, you weren't really paying attention. A neighbour's cat, a fluffy ginger tomcat that everyone adored, just vanished without a trace. Then, a week later, another pet from a few streets over went missing. And then another. These were isolated incidents, easily explained away. Perhaps a coyote, or maybe the pets had just wandered off. But for me, already on edge due to Alex's shifting behaviour, these disappearances started to feel like faint, ominous drumbeats in the distance, growing ever so slightly louder. I couldn't help but observe Alex's reactions, or more accurately, their lack of reaction to these local concerns. When the topic of the missing pets came up in conversation, Alex would often seem oddly detached, almost bored by it. Once, Alex made an offhand comment, something about the natural order or the fragility of small creatures, that struck me as incredibly cold, almost chillingly pragmatic. There was no sadness, no concern, just a kind of detached observation that felt alien coming from the friend I thought I knew. It was another small piece of a puzzle I was desperately hoping wouldn't form a terrifying picture. The narrator found themselves caught in an agonizing internal conflict. On one hand, there was years of loyalty, a deep-seated love for their best friend, and a desperate desire for all of this to be a terrible misunderstanding. On the other hand, there was the mounting evidence, the unsettling changes in Alex, the strange coincidences, and a gut-wrenching fear that was becoming impossible to ignore. They began to observe Alex more closely, scrutinizing their words, their actions, their silences, desperately searching for clues, for any rational explanation that didn't lead to the horrifying conclusions their mind was starting to draw. Every interaction became a tightrope walk, fraught with unspoken tension. They tried, ever so subtly, to probe Alex, to glean some insight into what was happening. They'd ask indirect questions about Alex's recent activities, or casually bring up the local disappearances to gauge Alex's genuine reaction. But Alex was a master of evasion. Their answers were always vague, non-committal, or worse, they'd turn the question back on the narrator, making them feel foolish or paranoid for even asking. Sometimes Alex's responses would carry a veiled, sinister undertone, a hint of dark amusement that made the narrator's blood run cold. It was like talking to a beautifully crafted mask with no idea what lay hidden behind it. The breaking point, the moment that would irrevocably shatter the remnants of their friendship and alter the course of the narrator's life, was fast approaching. The narrator found themselves at Alex's house one afternoon. The visit itself was not out of the ordinary. They'd spent countless hours there over the years, but on this particular day, the air in the house felt thick with an unspoken tension, a palpable sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The narrator's gaze kept drifting towards the basement door, a door Alex had always been strangely, fiercely protective of. It was usually locked, and any casual inquiry about it was met with a curt dismissal or a sudden change of subject. An overwhelming compulsion, a terrifying mix of fear and a desperate need for answers began to take hold of the narrator. Alex was upstairs, supposedly looking for something. This was their chance. Heart pounding, hands trembling, the narrator approached the basement door. It was unlocked, just a simple turn of the knob. Every instinct screamed at them to turn around, to leave, to pretend they hadn't noticed. But the horrifying suspicions that had been festering for months, the images of missing pets and vanished people, pushed them forward. They had to know. They had to see what Alex was hiding, even if the truth was something they could never unsee. And with that, we've reached the end of tonight's journey into the strange and the unsettling. Thank you for joining me, for stepping into these shadows where the ordinary twists into the terrifying. The stories we've shared tonight, tales of encounters that defy easy explanation and leave a lasting chill, are a stark reminder that the world can be a far stranger and sometimes far more dangerous place than we often like to believe. These accounts, whether born from the depths of a murky lake or the deceptive calm of a suburban neighborhood, have a way of sticking with you, don't they? They linger in the quiet moments just before you drift off to sleep. Now, I'm always curious to know which of these accounts resonated most deeply with you, which stories sent that unmistakable shiver down your spine or made you double-check the locks on your doors. Was it the unnerving presence of the girl in the red dress, the diver's brush with the unknown in the deep, the chilling demands of the strange girl from the club, the terrifying descent of an ex-boyfriend into obsession, or the horrifying discovery in a best friend's basement? Each story touches upon different fears, different unsettling possibilities, and I'd genuinely like to hear which one unsettled you the most. Let us know down in the comments below. Your thoughts and reactions are a big part of what makes this community so engaging. And speaking of community, if you have a horror story of your own, a strange encounter, an unexplained event that has left you questioning the nature of reality, we would absolutely love to hear it. So many of these incredible chilling tales come directly from you, the viewers, And sharing them not only allows others to experience that same sense of unease, but also in a way helps to process these bizarre and often frightening experiences. There's a certain comfort, perhaps, in knowing you're not the only one who has peered into the abyss and seen something unsettling stare back. So please don't hesitate to share your own encounters in the comments or through the channels listed in the description. Before you go, if you appreciated these stories and want to ensure you don't miss out on future explorations of the strange, dark and mysterious, please consider hitting that like button. It really does help the channel more than you know. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so you're the first to know when a new chronicle of the Unsettling is uploaded. We delve into these kinds of stories regularly, always seeking out those accounts that remind us that not all is as it seems. And finally, as you head off into the rest of your day, or more likely your night, maybe, just maybe, leave a nightlight on. You never know what shadows might be lurking.